Sarvebhyo Namaha. Starting from today, we have the pleasure of listening to Sandeep Balakrishna's lectures on the historian non-peril Sri Jadunath Sarkar. As most of our listeners here would know, this is a continuation of a lecture series on the same subject, Jadunath Sarkar. Sandeep Balakrishna had introduced us to the elevating life and prodigious, industrious work of the great historian Jadunath Sarkar. It is quite heartening that in recent years, interest in Jadunath Sarkar has been increasing, and that is as it should be, because for many years his memory, his body of work, and even his legacy was unduly relegated to oblivion. And he is certainly not a historian, not a scholar who deserves any of that. So it is very heartening that in recent years, at least, some interest has been shown in his body of work. In the last lecture series, Sandeep Balakrishna spoke to us about Jadunath Sarkar's upbringing and his mental makeup, how he went about his education, and the way in which he trained himself to write all those magnificent volumes that he went on to author. For instance, the multi-volume work on Aurangzeb, his work on Shivaji, and many inscriptions and things like that. His association with the other historian G.S. Sardesai, and his lifelong relationship with literature, his study of literature, which led him to write history in a manner that is elevating, not just documentation of facts, of chronicles, etc., but to write it with a literary and human touch, to have a enduring human appeal. Sandeep spoke to us all about those facets as well. And this time around, he will be continuing the lecture series. We got to know last time about Jadunath Sarkar's work on many aspects of Indian history, particularly the Mughal history, and how he ransacked all the primary sources, went to the basics, learned those languages himself, and underwent and endured all kind of tedium to author those masterpieces. This time around, Sandeep will talk to us about more of Jadunath Sarkar's works and share some more information about his legacy. Sandeep Balakrishna needs no introduction. He is a well-known author, and he is the founder and editor of the widely popular Dharma Dispatch, which is an online website. He is also an author and a translator. As many of us here would know, he is translated Dr. S.L. Bhairappa's Avarana, the path-breaking novel Avarana, into English as it goes by the eponymous title Avarana, or The Veil. And he has also authored many books on Indian history, on important issues that plague our society, unfortunately, even today. For instance, he has begun to write a multi-series volume on Mughal history or Islamic history, Invaders and Infidels. The first volume is out. It is published by Bloomsbury. He has authored several other books on Indian history and which are of civilizational importance. Just recently, he wrote a book on inscriptions, stories from inscriptions. Now, these books help us develop some respect and take pride in our own civilizational heritage, and that is the need of the hour. Sandeep has been working on these issues, has been kindling interest in our own history, in our own heritage, among our own people, and he has identified the call of time and has been working in that direction ceaselessly from more than 2 decades now. He was in the software industry but found his calling elsewhere and has been at it from more than 2 decades. So on behalf of the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs, all of our listeners, I extend a very warm welcome to Sandeep Balakrishna and request him to please begin today's lecture.
Namaste. Thank you, first of all, Shashi, always you're way too generous in your introduction. And a very good evening to all of you. As always, it's a great honor, a privilege, and infinite delight to speak at this sacred institution built by DVG. And I would like to welcome all of you to the second edition of exploring the rich contribution and the ennobling legacy of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar and his ascetic majesty of Indian history. Now, the previous edition of this lecture series was held about 6 months ago in June, if I remember correct. And so I think we can quickly recap some of the highlights of that first edition. We began with a historical context which helped us understand the forces and the circumstances that shaped Acharya Jadunath Sarkar's early life and the influences that molded his outlook towards choosing history, both as a professional career and as a sacred calling. And then we also saw how Jadunath Sarkar's majestic and stately father left a lasting influence and impact on him. And then we discussed some anecdotes about Jadunath's happy childhood, which he spent in Rajshahi in undivided Bengal. And just like how an enormous banyan tree is contained in a tiny seed, Jadunath's brilliance and his love for historical scholarship had sprouted really very early in his life, basically in his school days, and it remained with him till the end of his long and illustrious life. We also noticed how Jadunath had cultivated a strong sense of absolute self-reliance right in his pre-university days, and had narrated a beautiful anecdote about how Jadunath, young Jadunath, used to cook his own breakfast in his college hostel room with a kerosene stove. And after that, how he, took up football to improve his health. He had been infected with malaria and almost knocked the doors of death. And, his health condition was quite precarious. So he took up football to improve his health and become fit. And then we also looked at some other anecdotes of his college life, how he became a prolific, displayed prolific scholarly traits very early in his pre-university days. And then we also learned the thrilling and inspiring story of Jadunath's superhuman efforts to win the Premchand Roychand Scholarship, perhaps one of the toughest exams in India of that period. Basically, there was no second place. Either you got the scholarship or you didn't. Basically, anything that Jadunath touched in his student days and even later, anything that he touched, he turned it into gold. And literally in this case, he was awarded the gold medal both in English BA Honours exam and when he got the Premchand Roychand Scholarship. Jadunath was also the first Indian student to break all previous academic records in the Calcutta University by securing the highest marks in 3 subjects. He had scored 98 in English. It was an alien language. We must remember that this was sometime in the late 19th century. And then Jadunath started, his career as an English lecturer in the Ripon College in Calcutta. We saw, had a brilliant anecdote of his first day as a lecturer. And after that, he quickly shot to fame and he never looked back. So things, went to such a extent that both the Calcutta University and the Patna University, they fought with each other to keep Jadunath Sarkar on their campuses. Nanagbeku anta college management to horarta iddid kala adu. And then with the publication of his blockbuster thesis on Aurangzeb, Jadunath Sarkar had truly arrived on the scene of Indian history, and ever since he has left his lasting imprint. And his work on Aurangzeb still is the work that has immortalized his fame. And after this, we explored some details of his distinguished academic career spanning 60 years. He just knew professional retirement from a job, but not from his calling. So it was a highly eventful career which was populated by a vast repository of brilliant anecdotes and many, many inspiring lessons for leading a life dedicated to a lofty ideal. And Acharya Jadunath Sarkar indeed was the living embodiment of DVG's famous verse in Mankuti Manakagga, Ghanatattva Vondakke Dinaratri Manasotu, and so on. And then in the previous edition, we also noticed how meticulously he prepared himself before writing a new work. He would, uh, read out entire passages from a great historian named Green, for 5-6 days, and before starting each chapter or each book, each new book. And how, each work of Jadunath Sarkar became the authority in its field. And he was also an authority as well as a pioneer. In fact, several books have been published on Aurangzeb after Jadunath Sarkar passed away, but his 5 volumes on this Mughal tyrant still remain unsurpassed. You cannot beat them. New evidences, new information might have, emerged after Jadunath died, but the range, the depth, and the sheer treatment of Aurangzeb, of that topic by Jadunath, it cannot be surpassed by anybody. Na bhuto na bhavishyati. So, likewise, the same thing can be said about the 4 volumes on the fall of the Mughal Empire, and all of them show the same Sarkaresque distinction. And Acharya Jadunath Sarkar is clearly one of the handful of stalwarts of the Indian Renaissance who became a legend in his own lifetime. Next, we also saw some facets of his non-academic life in the previous edition of this lecture series. And topping this list of non-academic themes, it was Jadunath's enduring friendship with G.S. Sardesai. It was a friendship that endured till he died. And Sardesai himself was one of the great scholar and a stalwart of Marathi history. And although he was elder to Jadunath by about 8 years, G.S. Sardesai had an abiding respect and affection for this younger doyen of history and often sought his guidance. And the two of them exchanged hundreds of letters over 50 years, uninterrupted. And the letters themselves, by themselves, are a great study, and they reveal an extremely brilliant world of lasting friendship which was bound and forged by the shared bonds of a selfless love for knowledge, history, scholarship, and patriotism. And we will explore some more details of their friendship during the course of this edition. And next, we also observed another profound dimension of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar, which is his unsullied Shishya Vatsalya, or affection for his students, and how Jadunath personally trained at least 2 generations of scholars of Indian history who went on to become, legends in their own right, stalwarts in their own right. His homes in Calcutta, in Patna, in Darjeeling, they were not homes, but they were gurukulas in the real sense. He provided food and accommodation to all his promising students. He personally supervised their progress, and in fact, he sculpted their entire life. And all of them have left behind extremely detailed and very, very emotional anecdotes about him. I'll read out some of that in the course of these 3 days. And finally, we concluded the previous edition by listing out Jadunath Sarkar's prolific and invaluable corpus of scholarly work, both in English and Bengali. We also had a brief look at the awards and honors that he deservedly received for his eminence. And with that, we can begin the second and the concluding edition of this lecture series titled Jadunath Sarkar, or the Ascetic Majesty of Indian History. In the previous edition, I had mentioned that a good method for exploring Jadunath Sarkar's legacy must resemble an elaborate raga lapana. That is, it must be done in a deliberate, slow and systematic fashion, showing the full beauty of the raga by showcasing its various aesthetic aspects. But in hindsight, as I dug out more, it appears that this exploration actually resembles not a raga lapana, but a full-fledged kacheri or a musical concert which ends with a profound mangalam. And so in that spirit, over the course of the next 3 days, we will explore the remaining elements of Jadunath Sarkar's Himalayan legacy, and I have broadly divided this portion of my lecture into the following categories. First, we will look at some brief details of Jadunath Sarkar's contribution to public life as a member of the Bengal Legislative Council. Next, we will look at his foundational role and his contribution to Indian historiography, and especially how he shaped an institution called the Indian Historical Records Commission, or the IHRC. Then we look at Jadunath Sarkar's prolonged and extensive clashes with the Maharashtra History Lobby and its tragic outcome, tragic for him. And then we'll also see some extraordinary anecdotes written by various people that shows his personality, his temperament, his nature, his character, and last but not the least, his actual details of his method and his process of research and working. Then we'll look at a few glimpses, we'll have a few glimpses into his family life and his personal life. And finally, in the Mangalam, we will look at the last days of this legend's extraordinary life. Now, given that life is an organic whole with many interconnected and overlapping threads, all these categories that I just mentioned cannot be set in stone, nor do they occur in a chronological order, but that is just the nature of the beast. So you have to forgive me for that. So with that, we can begin with the first category, which is his role as a member of the Bengal Legislative Council, and perhaps it is the least explored facet of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar's life and career. This was his short stint as the member of the Bengal Legislative Council, like I said, and he served in that position from 1929 to 1933 as a nominated non-official member. And this needs a little bit of flashback. Now, today, there is no post called a non-official MLC. There is just an MLC, but there's nothing called a non-official MLC. But in the British era, members of the legislature were divided into 4 categories. The first category was something called the ex officio members. This was the highest rank of the administration, and it included the Viceroy or the Governor General and members of the British Imperial Executive Council. And the second category was the elected members. All of us are familiar with this, people who are elected to the legislature through popular vote. And the third category was the nominated official members. And these were directly appointed by the Governor General, and even though they were members, they were actually government officials or government employees. And the fourth and the last category were the nominated non-official members. These were also nominated by the Governor General, but they were not government officials. They were selected and they were drawn for various reasons and nominated for various reasons for their status or eminence or their record of service, and they were drawn from various fields of the society. And typically, this category of members included zamindars, rulers of princely states, lawyers, retired judges, journalists, editors, doctors, scholars, educationists, and so on. And in our own state of Mysore, we have the brilliant example of DVG, the founder of this institution, who served in this capacity as an MLC of the Mysore Legislative Council for 14 years. So back to Jadunath Sarkar. Like in his original domain of history scholarship, Jadunath Sarkar as an MLC also exhibited the same high standards. In his various letters to Sardesai, he repeatedly mentions, and I quote, "The Legislative Council demands my daily attendance." We'll come to this in a while. Jadunath has also left us monthly schedules, or what is called as monthly planners today, to use a contemporary term. He has left us monthly planners which shows the time. It is so meticulous, actually. You should read the whole thing. It shows the exact time that he has allotted for various tasks and the time that he had allotted for attending the council sessions. And I've pulled out a small extract. It is titled Engagements. and it is spread over 3 months. It's a quarterly planner in that sense. From October to December 1930, quote, 15th to 17th October, examine Dhaka University MA papers. 22nd November, deliver university convocation address at Allahabad. 24th November, deliver university convocation address at Patna. 24th November, same day. Okay, 24th November, deliver university convocation address at Patna. 24th November, marriage of daughter at Calcutta. So, 1st December, attend the opening of the new Bengal Council chamber in Calcutta. 2nd to 4th December, attend session of the Bengal Legislative Council. So this is relevant to us here. And finally, 22nd and 23rd December, attend session of the Records Commission at Patna. Close quote. Idon chikka sample ashte. So, unsurprisingly, Jadunath Sarkar's conduct in the Bengal Council was marked by the same characteristic traits: punctuality, discipline, scrupulousness, thorough preparedness, integrity, and above all, courage and fearlessness. Jadunath Sarkar spoke on the strength of facts, and he was never scared of opposing any unjust proposals or bills, and he was also the first person to support all good causes regardless of who proposed them. But to the credit of the British government, Jadunath was fittingly, they recognized his core strength. So they appointed him to something called the Select Committee on Education. And one of the major tasks of this committee was to come up with a comprehensive reform scheme for education in Bengal. And Jadunath Sarkar's eminent colleague on the committee was a person named Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the later founder of Bharatiya Janasangh. It is said that Jadunath Sarkar never missed a single session of the council, and he was unfailingly meticulous in his work on the Select Committee on Education. Ivattu Rahul Gandhi ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಕ್ರೀಚರ್ ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಸೆಷನ್ ಅಟೆಂಡ್ ಮಾಡದೆ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಊರು ಸುತ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಲಿಟ್ರಲಿ ಬೀದಿಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ 100% attendance. This was the standard of people who actually governed us. We were actually fit to be governed by such people. Anyway, so I have selected some representative anecdotes that show Jadunath Sarkar's prowess, his power, his character as in discharging the role as an MLC. The council's proceedings for 3 years, that is from 1929 to 1932, the entire proceedings, it runs up to more than 5,000 pages. And the anecdotes that I have selected are directly taken from the debates that he participated in. Obviously, I can't give the whole thing. So, the first one occurs in 1928. So, that year, the British bureaucrat, a very senior bureaucrat, his name is John Simon, he arrived in India with a promise of bringing constitutional reforms. This is the famous or infamous Simon Commission. But in the name of reforms, Simon proposed even more draconian controls over India. As a result, Mohandas Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement in 1929, which went all the way for more than a year, and it spread across India. And the British, as usual, they responded with extraordinary force, and police action reached brutal levels. Thousands and thousands of Indians were jailed and tortured, and they were detained without trial. And if that was not enough, at the height of this, brutality, the British government in Bengal put a proposal in the council seeking an additional amount of 8,78,000 for the police force. 8,78,000 in 1930. So their reasoning was ridiculous. This excess expenditure that they were seeking, they said that they needed this amount to meet similar outbreaks in the future. The question they forgot to ask themselves was this: Why did these outbreaks occur in the first place, and what can we do to prevent them from occurring in future? Anyway, so Jadunath Sarkar was naturally outraged, and several others in the council were also outraged, and they strongly protested against this proposal on the floor of the house and defeated the motion by 56 votes. What we need to remember is that this was an extremely risky move on the part of Jadunath, given that he was directly locking horns with an oppressive colonial power, which had the power to do anything basically and get away with it. Although the motion was defeated, the sad part was that the government still went ahead and approved the funds. And the second anecdote also occurred in the same year, that is in 1930, and it is related to the first anecdote. Now, this also needs a slight flashback. In 1929, the Bengal government had passed a ruthless ordinance, and it was titled the Bengal Criminal Law of 1925. This law was passed explicitly to crush the nationalist revolutionary freedom movement in the state. This law, it armed the British with sweeping powers. First, it killed the rights of habeas corpus. It reintroduced the measures of definite, indefinite and arbitrary arrest and detentions, and introduced trials by tribunal without a jury and without the right of appeal. And Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was one of the most notable victims of this oppressive law. But the law itself stated that it was a temporary measure and that it would be repealed after 5 years. And in 1930, this law had reached its expiry date. But by then, the British had become thoroughly addicted to it for obvious reasons, and they wanted to renew it for perpetuity, so to say. And when this law came up for debate in the council, Jadunath Sarkar and other members stood in the forefront, and they launched a spirited opposition to it. They cited copious examples of police abuse, which had led to hundreds of custodial deaths and permanent injuries to thousands of Bengali youth, and cutting across all ages. The debate continued over several weeks, and finally, Jadunath was part of the team that helped to defeat the motion. Now, if these two anecdotes show the uncompromising patriotism of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar, the third anecdote shows his deep concern for the Hindu society. And this concern came not from mere emotion or from directionless patriotism. It came from deep erudition, scholarship, and his own lived experience in Bengal. But this story does not begin in 1932. It actually begins in 1793. That year, Cornwallis was the Governor General of the East India Company, and he introduced one of the most oppressive measures to impoverish Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. He gave it a very polite name. He called it permanent settlement. It can mean anything, but it is more popularly or more notoriously known to all of us as a zamindari system. For the first time, more than anything else, it really broke the economic backbone of Bengal. And to cut a long story short, this so-called permanent settlement law, it created a new class of permanent hereditary landlords, and Cornwallis modeled this horrible system by, directly importing it from a similar system in England. So the next time, people talk about this classless society, egalitarian society of England, please look at this. We need to look at, how this fellow copied it and ruined Bengal's economy. So, according to this so-called permanent settlement law, the zamindar had to pay a fixed sum of money to the East India Company on a certain date every year. If the zamindar deposited even 1 rupee less, or if he was late in his payment, his entire lands would be confiscated by the East India Company. Literally, ರಾಜರ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿದ್ದವರು ಬೀದಿಗೆ ಬೀಳ್ತಾರೆ, literally. So what happens? And the British were not concerned with how the zamindar could manage to raise such enormous amounts of revenue. And the British were simply not bothered if floods or famine ruined the crop of the farmers. ದುಡ್ಡು ಬೇಕು ಅಷ್ಟೇ. And the results were predictable. The zamindars, suddenly they were faced with this new monster and they didn't know how to deal with it. So just to preserve their, ancient lands which they inherited, they began to outsource the revenue collection from that land to their subordinates, and as a result, a new system of middlemen emerged from the scratch. In Bengal and in neighboring states, this new network of middlemen was called Patnidars. And so, these zamindars who had genuinely cared for the welfare of the farmers and laborers working under them since several generations, overnight became their oppressors, or else, like I said, they would lose their lands. So, this was a simple but highly effective tactic by Cornwallis to break not only our society, not only our economy, but our society as well. But it not only broke our society and impoverished our people, it naturally led to widespread peasant revolts in a short span of time. ಆ ಮಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಸ್ಕ್ವೀಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಜನಗಳು ತಿರುಗಿ ಬಿದ್ದೇ ಬೀಳ್ತಾರೆ. But what it also did on a moral and ethical plane is that it completely corrupted the Indian society. ಇದರ ಪೂರ್ತಿ ಕರಾಳವಾದ ಅಷ್ಟು ಪಿಕ್ಚರ್ ನಿಮಗೆ ಸಿಗಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಪೂಜ್ಯರಾದ ರಾಮಸ್ವಾಮಿಗಳು ಪ್ಯಾಸೇಜ್ ಥ್ರೂ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಅಂತ ಹೊಸ ಬುಕ್ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಪರೀಕ್ಷಾ ಪ್ರತಿಷ್ಠಾನ ಇಸ್ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ಡ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅವೈಲೇಬಲ್, ಐ ಥಿಂಕ್ ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಬುಕ್ ಸ್ಟೋರಲ್ಲೇ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೋತ್ಥಾನ ಇಸ್ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ಡ್ ಸಾರಿ. ಸೊ ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ಯು ಶುಡ್ ರೀಡ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್. ಯು ವಿಲ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಬ್ಲಡ್ ಇನ್ ಯುವರ್ ಐಸ್, ನಾಟ್ ಟಿಯರ್ಸ್. And 135 years later, the same Bengal government moved a bill in the council to impose even harsher clauses on this already heartless law. This time, one of the clauses in this law, in this this new bill, one of the clauses delivered a death blow to the Patnidars. ಮೊದಲು ಜಮೀನ್ದಾರನ್ನ ಈ ರೀತಿ ಕರಪ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಈಗ ಪಟ್ನಿದಾರನ್ನ ಜೊತೆಗೆ the last farmer, the last person from whom the money is extracted, Raita, it would deliver a death blow to these people also. I obviously cannot get into the full details in the space of this lecture. So, at any rate, Jadunath Sarkar, along with, like-minded legislators, he passionately and vehemently argued against the motion and defeated it. And there was no better person than Jadunath to do this, because he was one of the acknowledged experts on this subject, and his classic work titled Economics of British India has a dedicated chapter called Permanent Settlement. Chapter title is called Permanent Settlement, which effectively punctures the British claims of the so-called benefits that they had brought to India. And in Sarkar's book, in that chapter, Jadunath estimates an annual loss of revenue of 4.5 crores from Bengal alone, thanks to this so-called permanent settlement system seeded by the evil genius of Cornwallis. And we must also recall the fact that Jadunath Sarkar's own father was a zamindar, and he had a first-hand experience of how the Sikh system worked from inside. And now we can look at the fourth anecdote. And this was a council debate in 1930, and the subject of the debate was educational reforms. It's quite humorous in a way. There was a Muslim MLC, and his name was A.K. Fazl-ul-Haq. So this fellow, he put forward a proposal to include maktabs and madrasas in the category of primary schools. So his argument was straightforward. He said that the government should directly run these madrasas and also give funding to madrasas which were being run by private people. Jadunath Sarkar immediately hit back, claiming that maktabs and madrasas are schools, alleged schools, that teach purely Islamic religion and not regular subjects like mathematics or science or language. And Sarkar finally, at the end of the debate, delivered the punchline, and I quote, "Unless maktabs and madrasas reach the standard of education and provide for teaching subjects prescribed for primary schools, they are not primary schools." Close quote. And the Muslim MLC obviously had to withdraw his proposal. And in another debate on a related topic, Jadunath Sarkar also defeated a bigoted bill where a bunch of Muslim MLCs wanted to introduce compulsory Islamic education and introduce Islamic prayers for 3 days in a week in all schools throughout Bengal. In all schools, not just Islamic schools. Fortunately, the Bengal of that era was lucky to have a proud son like Jadunath Sarkar, and it was not the Bengal of Mamata Banerjee, who has sanctioned a record number of madrasas in less than 10 years of her rule. And now we look at the final anecdote. As an eminent member of the Select Committee on Education, Jadunath Sarkar had prepared a comprehensive scheme for education reform in Bengal. This is really beautiful, actually. You should read the whole thing. But the government, he sent it to the government, but the government simply sat on the report and did not show even the basic courtesy to acknowledge it. And the reason was rather straightforward, and it was exposed by none other than Shyama Prasad Mukherjee on the floor of the council. And in his report, Jadunath Sarkar had passionately advocated giving compulsory military training for all students from a very early age up to the university level. In fact, it is a continuing tragedy that even after 75 years of a questionable independence that we got, military training for students, school students, remains an elusive dream in our educational system. In my personal opinion, compulsory military training and compulsory cultural education have the potential to alter India's fortune and its society and alter its destiny for the better in an unprecedented fashion. ಇದು ಎರಡು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಸಾಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. Anyway, back to our story. Even these brief anecdotes, 4 or 5 anecdotes that of Jadunath Sarkar, his stint as an MLC in the Bengal Council are eye-opening to say the least. But then a political role like an MLC was fundamentally unsuited to his temperament, which demanded the intellectual company of giants of both the past and present. And besides, the overall murky atmosphere of politics, the climate of routine dishonesty, and a lack of purpose and direction clearly disgusted him. And so we see him writing to G.S. Sardesai. It is a letter dated February 4th, 1932, and I quote, "And now the Legislative Council demands my daily attendance, but I have finally made up my mind to resign my seat at the end of the present budget session." Close quote. And Jadunath, as a man of honor, kept his word. And this we see in the last line of his long letter, which is dated 22nd July, that is 5 months after the previous letter. So in this letter, the last line is a simple declarative sentence. Quote, "I have resigned from the Legislative Council of Bengal." Close quote, end letter. So, not surprisingly, the radiant pearl had found a filthy pond of politics intolerable, and it had returned to its original abode, which is the depth of the ocean called scholarship. And with that, we can now explore Jadunath Sarkar's inestimable bequest to Indian historiography. And we can begin this discussion with 3 terms: history, historian, and historiography. To repeat the well-known definition, history is the study of the past, And a historian is one who studies the past. And historiography is the study of the writing of history. And historiography has emerged as a separate discipline, separate academic discipline, and it basically studies a wide range of themes, including how history has been written at various points of time in various countries, how history writing must be approached, what are the pros, what are the cons, what is a methodology that we should use both for research and writing, what are the techniques, how we should cull out sources, how we should evaluate them, how we should, weigh the evidences and so on. And as such, historiography is a continuously evolving discipline, which in turn has its own history, and I'll come to that now. In India, historiography as we know it even today, it began around 150 years ago, and it was obviously introduced by the colonial British or Europeans, broadly speaking. And when they introduced it, they also brought in their own biases when they wrote our history. But it was actually much worse than having a mere bias or writing history from a biased lens. The British actually had a stated official policy of not allowing alternative interpretations of Indian history. Naan bardide Indian history anta lekka avardu. In fact, the prestigious institution, it is known as the Royal Historical Society in England, it openly declared its intent, and I quote, to place Asian history firmly within the tradition of the British framework of historical study. It open agide. Now, it might be shocking for all of us today to learn that this racist attitude persisted even in the 1950s. That is after the British, quit all their colonial possessions. This was an attitude which was still prevalent in 50s. And for this, we have the first-hand evidence from another great scholar of Indian history. His name is Tapan Rai Chowdhury. So Tapan Rai Chowdhury went to Oxford to study for his higher education in history in the 1950s, and he gives us an eyewitness account of this pathetic academic climate even at the PhD level. And here's what he says, and I quote, "The Oxford University has made no formal provision for students working on Indian history beyond appointing a supervisor." Close quote. Now, he says that a former British major of the Indian Army, he was appointed as Rai Chowdhury's supervisor, and this major also supervised all students working for their PhD degrees on Indian history, irrespective of topic or period. Open supervisor. So this supervisor, he would decide the degree of the students, PhD students, working on topics as diverse as, Kushana art, Mughal painting, and all the way up to Maratha agrarian administration. And this British major's supervision, you know what it was limited to? It was limited only to giving lectures on Warren Hastings. Sarvagnana Devaraido. And these poor Indian students, they were forced to undergo this ordeal actually. It is nothing short of an ordeal. And this atmosphere, it is also the real worth of the so-called Oxford and Cambridge degree holders in Indian history who come back to India. ಆದರೆ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳ ಕಾಲ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಕೆಲವು ವಲಯದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ ಇಂಥವ್ರನ್ನ, ನೋಡ್ರಿ ಆಕ್ಸ್ಫರ್ಡ್ ರಿಟರ್ನ್ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ ಕಣ್ರಿ ಅವರು ಅಂತ ಭಯ ಗೌರವ ಎಲ್ಲ ತೋರಿಸ್ತೀವಿ. We don't know the inside story which Tapan Rai Chowdhury reveals. And remember that people like Romila Thapar and Irfan Habib were trained in England. But that is a different story. We'll look at it tomorrow or day after. And if this was the climate in 1950s, we can only imagine how much worse it would have been in Jadunath Sarkar's time. When, historiography was just evolving. And just to give you a small sample of this atmosphere in Sarkar's time, Indian history scholars during that era, they faced multiple obstacles. I can't cover the whole thing because it's way too much. So I will narrate just one. Perhaps it was the biggest obstacle. So in that period, the British government had blocked access to important papers and documents related to their conquest of India and their declared policies of looting us. And by the way, every single item of British policy, British strategy and decisions were written down in great detail and sealed and signed and countersigned and preserved very, very, very carefully. But to our, what is worse than this? To our eternal shame, our own princely states and chieftains and nawabs and zamindars and palegars, they also blindly imitated the same British tactic of denying access to their records, even to honest and dedicated scholars of Indian history like Jadunath Sarkar, Sardesai, Parsanis and other people. And in this horrible enterprise, our Rajas and, Palegars actually outclassed the British. Bala Sanbuddhi marta idru. In fact, Jadunath Sarkar himself gives us a sickening anecdote about the behavior of some of our princely states, and I'll summarize it here. Now, there was a legendary archivist. His name was D.B. Parasnis, and he was recognized as one of the greatest collectors of old documents. He was a leading, perhaps the greatest Indian archivist of his time. And he spent his entire life collecting valuable historical papers, coins, correspondence, daftars, letters, and he preserved them all in a very orderly manner, calendarizing them, cataloging them at all his, and he spent almost all his earning doing only this. So, Parasnis once wrote a letter to the Indore princely state requesting access to some of the archives of the Holkar dynasty, Ahalyabai Vamshadavaru. As expected, his request was immediately blocked. But Parasnis doggedly pursued his quest not for weeks or months but years. But the result was still the same, access denied. Finally, he got fed up and Parasnis directly wrote a letter to a very powerful British government official in London. And that was finally when the Holkar archives, or rather the princely state of Indore, granted access to Parasnis. And Jadunath Sarkar writes about, this incident in his matchless prose, and I quote, "The screw was finally put from the top, and then the Indore Darbar gave to fear that permission which it had refused to scholarship." Close quote. But just a week before Parasnis reached Indore, he had booked the tickets, planned his journey. Just a week before that, a telegram came to him from the Indore Darbar. And it informed him in very, very brief lines the following: the entire archive was destroyed in a fire accident. And the full truth emerged much later. This archive that Parasnis had requested access to, it was stored inside hundreds of grain sacks in an old building. That building, Gonichila basically, that building contained nothing else but these archives. Now, clearly, the Indore Darbar had been extremely furious that Parasnis had the gall to complain to the British government, and so it set fire to the whole building to take revenge against this man. About 200 years of priceless history was fed to flames just like that. This was not, merely any history. It was the most accurate, It was a first-hand history of the Peshwas, of the Gayakwads, of the Scindias, and the Holkars, written in their own words, written by their own officials in their own handwriting. And the whole thing was lost forever in this Sikh yagna rooted in dvesha, irrational spite. And Jadunath Sarkar narrates this whole incident with enormous pain. He calls it the greatest disappointment of Parasnis's life. And then, even more movingly, he writes, and I quote, "In his passionate devotion to his country's history, there could be no place for any other love in Parasnis's heart. Our countrymen, especially the youth who brood over our past, are mad after politics. But Parasnis, from his earliest youth, shunned politics as futile." Close quote. And finally, Jadunath denounces the Indore Darbar with undiluted candor, and I'll quote that again. "The usual obscurantist and obstructionist policy of native state officials was perverse. All the records had perished in the fire. Such is the harvest reaped by ignorance and folly in high places." Close quote. But this incident and many similar incidents like this, it had taught a profound and a lasting lesson to Jadunath Sarkar. And from these archival ashes, Jadunath Sarkar got a vision which translated into an idea and which finally took a concrete structure. Today, that structure is known as the National Archives in Delhi. But we'll get to that episode later in this lecture series. And back to our story. Jadunath Sarkar was not only working in a hostile era of Indian historiography, but he was also working in its nascent and formative period. And his greatest contribution in this area is the fact that he was literally one of the Indian founding fathers of a homegrown historiography of this country. In fact, the amount of material, that I got when I was doing research for this lecture series is truly astounding. A more competent researcher or a scholar like Shashi can write an independent book on Jadunath Sarkar's contribution to Indian historiography alone. Ashtu material sigate namage. But in the space of this lecture, I can at best cover only a few major areas. At the outset, we notice Jadunath Sarkar's indelible imprint on pioneering, shaping and sculpting and nourishing Indian historiography almost from the very beginning of his professional career. And we happily have three major sources that tell us this story of his contribution. The first source is his awesome corpus of work done for building up the Indian Historical Records Commission. I just mentioned that earlier. Indian Historical Records Commission, IHRC. This includes his annual addresses, occasion-driven lectures, seminars, and copious articles on a wide range of historical topics. Remember, he continuously wrote for its journal from its inception in 1919 till 1940 or 41. The second source is the prolific letters that he exchanged with G.S. Sardesai for half a century, and almost without exception, all these letters discuss various aspects of history and historiography, and we'll discuss a few points from that later in the series. These letters are also first-hand evidence that shows us the evolution of Indian historiography that these two stalwarts had envisaged and envisioned. Tumba personal touch ide, tumba chanagide actually. And the third source is a compendium of various prefaces and articles and seminars and workshops that Acharya Jadunath Sarkar tirelessly organized to discuss and debate Indian historiography. And from all these sources, we get a detailed and vivid picture of how Indian history writing as a discipline and Indian historiography as a nascent subject was being chiseled in the lab of Sarkar and Sardesai and other compatriots. It is a truly enthralling, informative and illuminative journey. Now, a central theme that underpins all of Jadunath Sarkar's historiography and in fact his entire body of work is a strict emphasis on primary sources. He was almost obsessive. He kept obsessing with primary sources of history and he calls them original historical materials. And to quote his own words, the first and the most indispensable condition of historical research is access to original documents. He who collects old state papers and other sources of history therefore makes research possible. And he benefits unborn generations of students by saving these unique records from destruction and dispersion. If in addition to this, he prints the records, he confers a still greater benefit and extends that benefit to a wider circle of scholars which may embrace the whole world. Close quote. Look at his emphasis on all these sources apart. What is more outstanding about the whole thing is his concern for future generations and his selflessness that shines throughout. But this was not a mere statement, it was not an empty prescription given by Jadunath Sarkar. He practiced whatever he preached. Rather, he practiced it first and then preached it. And throughout his long, productive, distinguished and useful life, Jadunath traveled throughout Bharatavarsha to procure these original materials. The moment he got an inkling that there was a source material, whether it would be useful or not, that's a different question. ಆಯಿತು ಕ್ಯಾತ್ಮಾರ್ನಹಳ್ಳಿಲಿ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ಯಾರೋ ಬರೆದ್ರು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ. ಕಲ್ಕಟ್ಟಾಯಿಂದನೋ ಡಾರ್ಜಿಲಿಂಗನೋ ಕ್ಯಾತ್ಮಾರ್ನಹಳ್ಳಿಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಬಂದು he would look at that, study it, clean it first, examine it in detail, and he would find often that it was useless. But he would undertake the journey in the hope that it would be useful. Anyway, and he used his own money to print and publish these original materials that he got with no expectation of reward or recognition. And indeed, Jadunath Sarkar was the ultimate hunter-gatherer of primary historical sources, and the outcome shows in his awesome body of work. It is because of this, it is because of his insistence on primary sources that Jadunath Sarkar did not write a single line of derivative history. In this context, this is what his close friend G.S. Sardesai says, and I quote, "Even if Jadunath needs only a small bit of information out of a manuscript that has fallen into his hands, he would translate the whole manuscript and publish it for common use." Close quote. The key word here is common use. It also has a profound synonym in Indian languages. It is called Loka Sangraha. How many scholars like Sarkar exist today? So, just by way of examples, I will read out a brief list of the original sources that Acharya Jadunath Sarkar had single-handedly discovered for the first time. So the first manuscript is the Akhbarat collection in Persian. This was a massive corpus of invaluable news items, reports and correspondence belonging to the Mughal period. Jadunath Sarkar spent several months in Jaipur, which was where it was discovered. He spent months there digging out this material and then several more months to organize this mass of papers in a logical order. ಅದು ಹೇಳೋಷ್ಟು ಸುಲಭ ಅಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡೋದು. It's actually donkey's work and ordinary people, they'll go mad. And next he also discovered and dug out thousands of letters, personal correspondence, court documents, private letters of kings and officials and papers of that kind, which had remained in the private archives and personal collections in both India and Europe. But one of the greatest discoveries of Jadunath Sarkar is a work by an official called Mirza Nathan. The name of the work is called Baharistan-e Ghalib. This priceless book was actually an eyewitness history written by this guy Mirza Nathan. He was a military officer fighting in Bengal under Jahangir's governor. And Jadunath discovered this work accidentally. It's quite interesting how he discovered it. So he heard, for the first time he heard the name of this book. It was mentioned in some other work that Jadunath was reading. And he immediately became restless. And he said, I have to get it, and launched a worldwide hunt for it. And finally, after several months, he located it in a library in Paris. But interestingly, this work was categorized in the library classification system. It was categorized as a novel, not as a history work. And but for Jadunath Sarkar, this work would be still lying in, forgotten and languishing in Paris. And finally, it was also Jadunath Sarkar who first discovered the valuable correspondence between Aurangzeb and his general, Raja Jai Singh. This single discovery, it proved to be a turning point in writing the history of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. And as I mentioned in the previous edition of this lecture series, it was precisely this work, this correspondence, that completely ended the career of the racist British historian named Grant Duff, who had portrayed Shivaji as a mountain rat and rebel and all kinds of, ugly names. Now, Jadunath Sarkar's obsession with primary sources, original materials, letters, correspondence, and so on, it was also a component of his unshakable conviction or shraddha in his quest for truth. And in every speech that he gave to the IHRC, we notice a sense of anxiety, a sense of anxious urgency in his words. I'll read out a small excerpt from his address to the 1928 session of the IHRC. Quote, "The huge and daily growing bulk of records makes their proper preservation and speedy consultation an increasingly difficult task, unless they are sorted and classified and the useless mass of papers are laid aside so that the really historical documents may receive proper care, and also to guard against the destruction of any paper of historical value through ignorance or oversight." Close quote. Prati speech allu idna helta iddiದ್ದು. And we will return to this point later in these 3 days. But for now, we can look at the kind of outstanding results that Jadunath Sarkar's lifelong quest for original historical material had produced. He gave a farewell address to his students on 20th April 1957, that is just 1 year before he passed away. It is deeply moving and it is also highly inspirational. I'll just read out just a couple of samples from it. Quote, "Time has now brought me to the brink of the great ocean of eternity, and as I look back, I take this opportunity to bid farewell to my friends and pupils with gratitude for the love and kindness with which they have enriched an unusually long life. My message to my pupils and my pupils' pupils is one of hope. I bid them to be of good cheer because the opportunities for carrying on research in Indian history on the Indian soil are now unimaginably great, and the right atmosphere for this type of work has also been created around us. When I first set my hand to the plough in 1891, research, except in Sanskrit, meant only the pirating or the translation of modern English or French books, and we had no other resources. But today, no genuine worker on Indian history is content unless he has mastered the language of the original authorities and can utilize the original records, dispatches, state papers, and inscriptions, which are the primary indispensable sources. Work in the right way, for the means are ready at hand and the reward is sure." Close quote. Extremely inspiring. But what Acharya Jadunath Sarkar did not deliberately mention, was the fact that he was the foremost among the giants who had created this right atmosphere, and he was among the stalwarts who had excavated these original sources. He does not mention that. Another important element of Jadunath Sarkar's message is his emphasis on doing research in Indian history on the Indian soil. And this once again brings out his deep sense of patriotism and shows how he had recognized the need for decolonizing Indian history. And in fact, he explicitly stresses upon the urgent need to thoroughly decolonize ourselves. And I will read out 3 powerful quotes from him on this topic. The first: after Jadunath had finished the 4th and the final volume of The Fall of the Mughal Empire, this is what he wrote to G.S. Sardesai in a letter, and I quote: "I can say that I have written it not with ink, but with my heart's blood. In saying so, I am not thinking of my personal sorrows and anxieties, but of the subject matter of the last chapters, the imbecility and vices of our rulers, the cowardice of their generals, and the selfish treachery of their ministers. It is a tale that makes every true son of India hang his head in shame." Close quote. And the second: "India has been standing still, glorifying in the wisdom of our ancestors, or at best, borrowing thoughts and material products from Europe at second hand." Close quote. Third: "India cannot afford to remain forever an intellectual pariah, a beggar for crumbs at the doors of Oxford or Cambridge or Paris or Vienna. She must create within herself a source of the highest original research and assume her rightful place at the School of Arts." Close quote. ಇದು ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ. And so, when Jadunath, as Shashi said, when Jadunath Sarkar was ransacking the libraries of all these European cities, what he was actually trying to do was trying to rescue and reclaim and rejuvenate the real soul and culture of Bharatavarsha. And history was a medium that he had chosen to do this rescue work. But in hindsight, it is a national crime that the right atmosphere and the painstaking decolonization efforts that Jadunath Sarkar and other stalwarts, all this atmosphere that they had initiated and they had built up and they had, nourished it, it was nearly demolished. Not nearly, it was thoroughly demolished by the workers of the Communist Party of India disguised as historians. What is even worse is that all these vandals of Indian history continue to remain unpunished till date. They have suffered no consequence, absolutely no consequence. Anyway, let's get back to our story. And now I must mention another extraordinary anecdote that shows the other side of Jadunath Sarkar's extraordinary command over primary sources. Like in every other field, Indian epigraphy, or the study of inscriptions, Indian epigraphy, primary sources, this field also had its share of fakes and crooks and frauds. In simple language, what this means is that it is the existence of forgeries and spurious inscriptions and documents. In Indian languages, these are known as Kuta Shasanas. And Jadunath Sarkar was one of the acknowledged experts at exposing them. And to our great fortune, we have one such expert living in our midst today. His name is Shatavdani Dr. R. Ganesh, and I will give you just one simple example. We need to read his footnotes and expositions in a very slim but authoritative book titled Vibhuti Purusha Vidyaranya. Unfortunately, it's a very, very highly underrated work. When you read these footnotes and explanations, we fully understand his prowess in this area of, shattering these Kuta Shasanas, which means the other side of establishing historical truths is also exposing historical frauds. Now, sometime in the 1920s or maybe early 30s, a small chieftain, he called himself Maharaja. So this man, his fiefdom was somewhere near Gulbarga. So this fellow hired a Pandit who was also a Persian scholar. Then he gave this Pandit a huge bunch of farmans. Farmans are royal orders. It's a Persian word. So he gave this Pandit a huge a bunch of farmans which were written in Marathi, and he asked this Pandits to translate them into Persian. What the Raja did not tell the Pandit, and this guy was an innocent poor man, he was doing this basically for his livelihood. What this Raja did not tell the Pandit was his motive behind this translation. Eventually, all these farmans were translated, and the Raja published a large volume of this translation and claimed that it was authentic history. After this, he approached every respected historian in India, at least in Maharashtra, and he gave them the book and asked them for their endorsement. ನೋಡಿ, ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದೆರಡು ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಮಾತು ಬರೀರಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದರು ವೇರಿಯಸ್ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ. ಸೊ ಅಕಾರ್ಡಿಂಗ್ಲಿ ಹಿ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ವಿಸಿಟೆಡ್ G.S. Sardesai's house and both in Kamshet, Pune and Bombay several times. They were very persistent and said, look, you have to read this, you have to read this and give your endorsement. And not only that, he pressurized Sardesai to send these alleged farmans to Jadunath Sarkar seeking Sarkar's endorsement. The shrewd Raja, extremely cunning fellow, he knew that an approval or endorsement from Jadunath Sarkar would mean the ultimate stamp of authority. And so Sardesai, he was unable to refuse this Raja. He sent the work to Jadunath Sarkar. And now, let's hear the rest of this story from Sardesai's own mouth. Quote, I now realized how the Raja went about trapping every worker in history. Worker andre scholar anta basically. He came to my house here and several times in Bombay, and at last at my request sent you the farmans. I cannot too highly admire your prescience in refusing to pass a judgment on the papers placed before you. I fortunately escaped under your shelter. Andre, he did not write. Jadunath Sarkar opinion ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ, ಇದು ಬೇಡ, ಇದು ಸರಿಗಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ. ಸೊ ಇವರು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಎಂಡೋರ್ಸ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಬರೆದಿದ್ರೆ ಇವ್ರ ಹೆಸರೇ ಹಾಳಾಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಸೊ ದಟ್ಸ್ ವೈ ಹಿ ಸೇಸ್, ಐ ಫಾರ್ಚುನೇಟ್ಲಿ ಎಸ್ಕೇಪ್ಡ್ ಅಂಡರ್ ಯೋರ್ ಶೆಲ್ಟರ್. Balakrishna is made a dupe. Balakrishna is another scholar. ಪಾಪ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ ನಂಬಿಟ್ಟು ಎಂಡೋರ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ. I see how your constant caution saves many a pitfall, and why you are frequently warning scholars against wanton forgeries too common with frail humanity. Close quote. But meanwhile, while this was happening with Sarkar and Sardesai, something else had also happened on a parallel track. B.A. Saletore, or Bhaskar Anand Saletore, one of the greatest historians of Vijayanagara Empire primarily and Indian history. So he had also received a copy of this alleged farmans, and he instantly condemned the whole collection as a forgery. And the panicked Pandit, when he heard of this condemnation, that poor fellow, the translator Pandit, he and his son rushed to Saletore and they confessed the whole story. And I paraphrased the conversation of the Pandit. He said, look sir, we are really innocent. We only followed the Raja's orders and cooked up the Persian passages in the farmans. Close quote. So Sardesai, he writes the epilogue to this disgusting episode, and I quote, Saletore is soon going to expose a whole transaction with incontrovertible proof. Close quote. Now, it is a great testimony to Sardesai's decency that he has not mentioned the name of the Raja. He has not told us his motive for engaging in such a brazen forgery and passing it off as history. Basically, it is historical cookery. And there was no shortage of such rajas and chieftains in that period. It's quite unfortunate to, I recall Kuvempu's words in a different context. He says this in the context of so-called researches on Ramayana. ಇಂತಹ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಮರ್ಯಾದೆ ತರುವಂಥ ಕೆಲಸ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. So that applies to this field also. Now, regrettably, of late, this kind of research has proliferated in our country at an alarming pace, giving fantastic dates to Ramayana, Mahabharata, the existence of unknown galaxies, drawing, listening to, recording the sound of Omkara, rotating around the sun and things like that. So, whatever. So, we can conclude this section examining Acharya Jadunath Sarkar's pioneering contributions to Indian historiography by citing three major landmarks. The first was his profound concern towards his posterity, that is, the next generations. And I can reasonably surmise that Jadunath Sarkar was fully aware of the high standards that he had set, and he wanted future generations to at least measure up to those standards. If they could not meet those standards, they could measure up to that. This once again demonstrates his towering stature and what can only be called his acharyatva, and his innate feeling that knowledge will be preserved and it will only grow through this generational transmission. And so one of his lifelong ambitions was to establish a seminar of historical research. And he derived this inspiration from the 19th century German historian, another great stalwart. His name is Leopold von Ranke. And this man, he successfully implemented the seminar method of teaching history. And the seminar method is basically straightforward. Students are invited from various parts of the country in small groups, and each group chooses a particular subject or specialization. Then it devotes its entire time to share research and knowledge that each scholar has gained. And sometimes reading material is assigned to different groups. Sometimes papers are read out and debates and discussions are conducted. And the seminar participants meet regularly at different intervals throughout the year. And the effectiveness of this method of teaching and learning, I think it's quite obvious to all of us. Tumba olle method ide actually. This was one of the primary reasons that Jadunath Sarkar used to invite history students, serious history students and scholars, to stay at his house so that they could learn the accurate methods and techniques of historical research. He bore all the expenses of their boarding and lodging, and in some cases he even paid their travel fare and other incidental expenses. And at regular intervals, he wrote a lot of letters to various students throughout India. One of his most devoted pupils, his name is K.R. Konungo, he tells us the sad outcome. Papa, and I quote, the response to these letters was poor. Close quote. But the steely Acharya was not disappointed, he was not discouraged. He kept on writing these letters to students, and finally, between October 2nd and October 6th, 1938, Jadunath Sarkar finally organized one such seminar at G.S. Sardesai's house in Kamshet near Pune. And Konungo narrates what happened in that seminar, and I quote, Jadunath invited students on whom he could rely for continuous devotion to Clio. Clio is the muse of history, the god of history, from all over India, and gave them good grounding in the study and research of history. He forged the raw iron ore into tolerably good steel in his workshop, good enough in later times to fill the chair of history at several universities. But Jadunath is less fortunate in his pupils, none of whom have grown up even to waist high of this master's stature in fame and achievements. Close quote. ಈಗ ಮೌಂಟ್ ಎವರೆಸ್ಟು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡರ್ಡ್ ಅಂತ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಅದರ ವೇಸ್ಟ್ಗಾರ ಬರಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ ಅದೇ ದೊಡ್ಡದು ಅನಿಸುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಟು ದ ಸೆಮಿನಾರ್. A total of 32 budding scholars, research students and other people, they attended the 5-day seminar. Unfortunately, it was the first and the last seminar of this kind. I'll read out a brief list of the notable scholars who had participated in that seminar. B.A. Saletore, M.H. Krishna, Maharaja Raghubir Singh, Pandurang S. Pislurkar, G.S. Sardesai, Moti Chandra, and others. And at this stage, I must also share another anecdote regarding this brilliant seminar. And this comes from Deepesh Chakraborty. He's the author of a very, very fine book on Jadunath Sarkar. It is titled The Calling of History. So he has dug us this anecdote. It's a little difficult to read. The prose is very dull. But you have to read it for the wealth of information that he gives us. So Deepesh, once he learnt of this seminar in Kamshet, he and his friends, his research, his colleagues, they went to Kamshet. They actually visited Kamshet about 10 years ago. We are in 2022. So they must have gone sometime in 2012 or 13. So they visited Kamshet looking for Sardesai's house. And, he says that this was a place of pilgrimage for us. And, this was also the sacred venue of Jadunath Sarkar's seminar. And Deepesh describes the present condition of Kamshet and that house. And I quote, "Ugly multi-storied buildings have appeared on congested roads, integrating Kamshet into the history of contemporary India. There are plans to make Kamshet into a paragliding center for tourists. Most people in the place have completely forgotten about the Sardesai family, who were once a well-known family in the neighborhood. Nobody we spoke to could remember G.S. Sardesai's name, who played such a prominent role in Marathi history and historiography. Eventually, we met Mr. Fali J. Pastakia, a powerful and important real estate developer of that area." Close quote. And what happened next was that Deepesh told this real estate don, developer or whatever. So Deepesh told him the purpose of his visit. Look, we have come to see G.S. Sardesai's house, and this was the venue of this great, extraordinary seminar. And then Fali thought, okay, these are decent people. So he instructed his driver, and he said, look, you take him to that house. It's there in that locality, I know. You take them to that house and show them around. And the driver took them to the house, obviously, and this was how it looked. I'll quote. "The building is still in a lush and green part of the village. The house looked locked up and abandoned, surrounded by sheets of corrugated aluminium and a garden grown wild. Making our way through dirt and cobwebs, we found an old photograph of Sarkar's best friend, Nana. Nana was Sardesai's nickname. And some old correspondence and documents mixed up with some decaying pages of books that no longer existed as a whole. We walked on the veranda where the participants in the 1938 seminar met and took photos of the house." A photos illa ide a book alli. "For us, as historians, this was like a pilgrimage. The driver, Mr. Chauhan, found it very puzzling that we should be poring over the very old and dusty papers with such intensity, but he kept saying with some measure of wistfulness that he was sure that what we were doing was naked calm, virtuous work. Sardesai and Sarkar would perhaps have agreed with the driver." Close quote. ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಯಾವ್ದಾರ ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಾಗಿದೆ, ದಿಸ್ ವುಡ್ ಬಿ ಪ್ರಿಸರ್ವ್ಡ್ ಲೈಕ್ ವಾಲ್ಡನ್ ಪಾಂಡ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಥೋರೋಸ್ ಎಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಎಮರ್ಸನ್ಸ್ ಎಸ್ಟೇಟ್. I don't know exactly what we have done to this ancient civilization. This was the millennial global magnet of education. It was a magnet of scholarship, of philosophy, of a pursuit of truth and all that is noble. I don't know exactly where we went wrong and how horribly we went wrong. ಯಾತಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ಇಷ್ಟೆಲ್ಲ ಕಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಟರು ಜದುನಾಥ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರ್ ಅಂತ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾವ ಪುರುಷಾರ್ಥಕ್ಕೆ ತಮ್ಮ ಇಡೀ ಜೀವನ ತೆಗೆದು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅವ್ರು ಇದ್ಬದ ಆಸ್ತಿ ಸಂಪತ್ತು ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಕಾಣದ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಧ್ಯೇಯದ ಸೇವೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕರಗಿಸ್ಬಿಟ್ರು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಸಿನ್ಸ್ ವೆನ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ವಿ ಬಿಕಮ್ ಎ ನೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಶೇಮ್ಲೆಸ್ ingrates? I don't know. Like I said, in any other country, Sardesai's house in Kamshet, its hallowed precincts would have been transformed into a national treasure and a monument. I think with that we can close the first day of this 3-day lecture series on Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. I once again thank the organizers of Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs and my good friend Shashi Kiran and all of you in the audience for giving me a patient hearing. Namaste.